Okay, we're gonna continue. Okay, welcome back to Clark County today. Our guest is Tom Niewulis, talking about how he takes on the persona of Samuel Adams.
Right.
So we were just talking about what you do you actually get dressed up in the garb of the day, and
Yes.
you have whatever you do to appear like him and speak like him.
Yes.
Does your voice change, or do you just simply use your natural voice? It's the message that
That's right. It's
that
the
portrays
message.
him.
I'm still working on that Massachusetts accent, but that's going to take me a day or two to continue that.
Okay, how long have you been doing this?
It's over 2 years now.
Okay.
And how I started was We the People in Vancouver was getting ready to have an event in September, and it was a September 11th type of event. And they were looking at, they wanted the Tea Party thing was a big thing at the time. And so they were looking at characters and Samuel Adams, and they asked for someone to do that.
And you volunteered?
And I volunteered. I raised my hand.
Were you already, at that point, a significant fan of Samuel
Yes,
Adams, or you
I
discovered
was.
it at that point?
No, I was a fan of Samuel Adams.
So it was an easy choice for you.
Yes.
You said, yep, I'll
Yes.
take that guy. I'll bring him to life.
Yes. I've been studying the founders and our principles for over 25 years. So the real interesting thing is that, many folks and I'm so delighted and excited about people taking the stands that they're taking today on the environment and going, what it is about the Constitution. We need to get back to those principles and all of that. Because there's been a number of us that have been engaged in that, but not having the voice that is now being able to come out.
If you were to pick a few of the principles or a few of the passions and just elaborate, or not elaborate, but basically list some of those things he felt passionately about, and that he would address, what are some of those things? And maybe how, especially in contrast to the direction that we're going today, or the way that we're trying to address issues in contrast to how he did. Can you pull up a few of those?
Sure, a few of them right off the top is that we're principled based on our values, morality that comes from God. So natural law and understanding that. He actually wrote, prior to the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of the Right of the Colonist. And in that, it talked about very much same principles then that Thomas Jefferson was studying and understanding and actually articulated. The only reason that Samuel Adams was not one of the contributors to the writing of the Declaration of Independence is because he was working on the Articles of Confederation, so he was not part of that committee.
So when we read we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Yes.
That was something that would not only Samuel Adams, he believed,
Yes.
but Thomas Jefferson really did a great job in writing that. But Samuel Adams was writing, he was already occupied about other very important foundational documents as well.
So what all the founders and what Samuel Adams really pressed into was that idea of what was natural law, and it came from the Creator. And that was the most important thing. And so everything that he looked at in law and studied all the way back through history and his understanding of law always pointed back to that law comes from God. And that man institutes laws for the protection of society in a generalized way. But if it doesn't have that moral significance to it, then it doesn't mean much of anything. And that was the real argument and why he was so passionate in the many things that he did with what was happening in England and what was being put on the colonies of the day, because there were clear violations of the English Constitution, which had that same principles in its design on common law and natural law.
So did Samuel Adams have people of his day that would take the other side of the argument, and he would have to debate with them in order to try to convince them that, hey, these principles need to be a foundation in order for us to have the enduring nation that we're going to build?
Well, it was interesting is that the principles were fundamental of the day because of the churches. Many people don't understand, we don't see that today in our churches today, is that there were, what came about in the Revolution were called the black robe ministers, and they were the ones that actually stood in their pulpits and and spoke to these exact principles. Because the interesting thing that he understood and he talked about, as well as other founders, is that if the principles come from God, individual liberty, not only from a liberty for our souls in relationship to God, then what that meant was also how we would have that individual liberty within the context of how we lived our lives within the formation of society.
So he normally didn't have to argue very much there. Most of the people, it was normal for people to assume that, of course, we were created, of course there's a creator, we are accountable to him, and that was just the normal way that people, that was permeated society back then. Is that right?
Correct. But where the argument came into hand was with the kingsmen and with the overlords, no different than what we see today in many ways, and what we're seeing in the oppositions of freedom and liberty, even in the context of our own country.
You named yardsmen and somebody else. What were those terms?
Well, the overlords as well as the kingsmen.
Okay.
And the kingsmen were those that were real close to the king. Okay. And so it would be the House of Lords, even though there were some friendly to the colonies. There were those that, people of power will take, no matter what it is, if they don't have those fundamental principles that we just talked about relative to understanding what God's principles are, and they'll take and they'll say, okay, we have the divine right of the king, and that's what they stood on at that time. And so that's what a lot of the argument was in the colonies, was that the king had the right to do whatever he wanted, although the colonies had charter. And what they forgot was that the people were English citizens. So they weren't just, some common slaves or to be reckoned with, that the king could come in and just do whatever. So they started stomping all over the rights of the common citizenry and acting differently to the people in America than they actually did to those in England.
So this top-down government, where this divine right of kings, the power that was claimed that okay, we're going to dictate to the people, in contrast to what our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, that whole idea sounded like it was new back then, that power is given to the people, and the bottom-up government, where people then are the ones to elect representatives that speak for the people, not this top-down that dictate to the people. So that direction was something, sounds like that was brand new.
Well, it was being debated at that time. So when we look at liberal and conservative compared to what it meant from a European perspective, I have a booklet that I wrote on that gives some real interesting content. But more importantly was that about 100 years earlier, Algernon Sidney actually wrote about that and was beheaded. He had to go to France and run away because he said the divine right of the king is something, that isn't true. But everything that you just spoke to is true, that when you have a constitution in place, then the people have the right to, come from a self-rule perspective. And the charters that were established in the colonies really personified that and allowed it to take and really gestate more than what it could do in continental Europe. So that was what really started to fraction a lot of that, is that the American people and the colonists started to take that to heart and understand that, wait a minute, if we're going to operate from a constitutional perspective, then what we have here is that the king is just, he's just an administrator over the decision process that Parliament should bring to bear from a point of representation. And the colonies did not have clear representation. So that was another a fracturing point in the whole debate.
It's a very interesting, I look at the situation back then and wonder where, and if ever, that situation has ever been repeated. Because here you have a brand new nation that pops up, a new discovery of land on the earth. People come here. They're having to define what kind of government are we going to rule ourselves with? What kind of foundations are we going to lay? Where in the world has that ever happened before, where you actually start with a clean piece of paper and are really forced into defining these things because of the oppression, because of the tyranny, because of the abuse of power that the government that already was claiming this territory was forcing these people into. They had to make a choice, and they had to lay those foundations, and so they really thought through that process. I wonder if people realize how unique the United States is in this birth that was bottom up, clean piece of paper,
That's right.
from scratch. Think about the principles,
That's right.
lay them out, adopt those, and build a nation.
Yeah.
Very unique.
Yeah. And in addition to everything that you said, they looked at it from economics, because that was a major contention. So, all of those things added into it, and they were well studied. See, in our education system today, we don't have classical education. In my opinion, we have more indoctrination than than we actually do in education.
What's the difference? Define.
Well, the difference is that a classical education, or what they called at that time a liberal education, was that they looked back through history. So they read Cicero, they read Aristotle, they read the Greeks. As a matter of fact, by the time they went to Harvard, or to Princeton or to the others, the majority of people knew Latin, Greek, and French, or some additional languages. And this was usually at 14, 16. They could read and write within those languages, so they could read the originals. So when they looked at the different forms of government, they actually studied through history all these various philosophies and ideas and forms of government, looked at even the Bible was fundamental, and we hear David Barton talk about how significant it was in there, and it's true when you really do the study, how much they depended on the Old Testament for structure as well. But what it came down to was that they understood what democracy was, because they read about it in Greek and
You're talking
Latin
about pure
history.
democracy
Pure
that's not
democracy.
limited by law.
Correct. So they knew democracy. They knew socialism based on what they read in Plato. The Platonic writings are very socialistic, and they rejected that, to the effect that my cousin John, when he wrote to Thomas Jefferson one time, said, "I studied Plato in all his forms, including the English, French, and the original language, and I was so disappointed in the result." So this is how they looked at history to form our government. So those that call America a democracy do not understand our history. They do not understand the basic writings, to your point, that established this nation as the first ever free nation with self-determination on the planet.
Yes, with a rule of law, where we pledge
Correct.
allegiance to the republic.
That's right.
There's not a democracy word in that Pledge of Allegiance,
right.
although we are a democratic republic.
Yes.
So that foundation is a very important difference. No matter how many people want to be able to infringe on the right or on the rights, or to take the life of a minority of people, law will prevent them from doing that. It's not a pure democracy.
Correct.
Interesting principles.
Yes.
Well, we've come up to another break point, so we'll wrap up that, and we'll continue in a moment.
Great. Thank you.